Rome is usually pictured as one thing, an empire of legions, emperors, and marble columns. But that empire only exists for about half of Rome's actual story. Before there were emperors, Rome was a kingdom, and then for nearly 500 years, a republic that famously despised the very idea of kings. Getting from a small village on a hill to a superpower stretching from Britain to Syria takes almost exactly 1,000 years of war, reform, betrayal, and reinvention. This is the entire history of the Roman Empire. According to legend, Rome is founded in 753 BC by Romulus, who kills his twin brother, Remus, in an argument over where exactly to build a city, and then names it after himself. The real story is messier and less dramatic. A cluster of small villages on the hills above the Tiber River gradually merges into a single settlement around roughly that time, heavily influenced by its more sophisticated neighbors, the Etruscans, who supply Rome with its early kings, its alphabet, and much of its early culture. For almost 2.5 centuries, Rome is ruled by a series of 7 kings, some Latin, some Etruscan, laying down the city's early religious and political institutions. But in 509 BC, the final king, Tarquin the Proud, is overthrown after his son commits a notorious act of sexual violence against a noblewoman named Lucretia, an event that becomes the founding trauma of Roman politics. The Romans expel the monarchy entirely and swear never to be ruled by a king again, a promise that shapes Roman government for the next 500 years. In place of a king, Rome establishes the Republic, a system built almost entirely around distrust of concentrated power. Executive authority is split between 2 annually elected consuls, each able to veto the other, while a senate of wealthy former officials advises on policy and controls state finances. But early Republican Rome is deeply divided between the patricians, a small hereditary aristocracy, and the plebeians, the much larger class of ordinary citizens locked out of real political power. Over generations, in a struggle historians call the conflict of the orders, the plebeians win major concessions, including their own elected representatives called tribunes, and eventually the 12 Tables, Rome's first written law code, making the legal system at least somewhat transparent rather than an aristocratic secret. While sorting out its internal politics, Rome is also fighting almost constantly with its neighbors. Etruscan cities, rival Latin communities, and mountain tribes like the Samnites are all defeated and absorbed over the course of the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, though not without setbacks, including a humiliating sack of Rome itself by invading Gauls around 390 BC. By 275 BC, after defeating the Greek king Pyrrhus of Epirus in a costly series of battles that give us the term Pyrrhic victory, meaning a win so costly it's barely worth having, Rome controls the entire Italian peninsula. It's no longer just a city, it's the dominant power in Italy, and its ambitions are only getting bigger. That ambition puts Rome on a collision course with Carthage, a wealthy North African trading power controlling much of the Western Mediterranean. Over more than a century, the two powers fight 3 brutal wars known as the Punic Wars. The First Punic War, fought mostly over control of Sicily starting in 264 BC, forces Rome to build a serious navy from scratch, and Rome wins, but just barely. The Second Punic War is far more dangerous. In 280 BC, the brilliant Carthaginian general Hannibal marches an army, including war elephants, straight across the Alps into Italy and inflicts a series of devastating defeats on Roman armies, culminating in the catastrophic Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, where tens of thousands of Roman soldiers die in a single day. But Rome refuses to surrender, grinding Hannibal down over years of attrition rather than facing him head-on again, while a young general named Scipio takes the fight directly to Carthage's homeland in North Africa. In 202 BC, Scipio, earning the title Africanus, finally defeats Hannibal at the Battle of Zama. Rome isn't satisfied with just winning, though. Decades later, in the Third Punic War, Rome besieges and utterly destroys the city of Carthage itself in 146 BC, selling its survivors into slavery and salting the earth of a rival that had once nearly ended Rome for good. With Carthage gone, Rome expands rapidly across the wider Mediterranean, defeating the Macedonian kingdoms, conquering Greece, and clashing with the massive Seleucid Empire in the east. By the middle of the 2nd century BC, Rome is unquestionably the dominant power in the entire Mediterranean world. But success brings its own problems. Enormous wealth from conquest flows disproportionately to a small elite. while small farmers, many of whom had fought in Rome's wars, are squeezed out by huge slave-worked estates. Two reforming brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, try to redistribute land to ordinary citizens in the late 2nd century BC, and both are murdered by opponents within the Roman elite, a chilling sign that Roman politics is starting to solve its disputes with violence rather than debate, that violence only escalates. The general Marius reforms the Roman army, opening recruitment to landless citizens who now depend on their commanders, rather than the state, for pay and land afterward, quietly creating armies more loyal to individual generals than to Rome itself. Marius and his rival Sulla plunge Rome into open civil war, and when Sulla wins, he marches his own army into the city and has himself declared dictator, ordering brutal purges of his political enemies. It's a preview of exactly how the Republic is eventually going to die, not through foreign conquest, but through Romans turning their own legions against each other. That final collapse arrives with three of the most famous names in ancient history, Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, who form an unofficial power-sharing alliance known as the First Triumvirate. Caesar spends the 50s BC conquering Gaul, modern-day France, in a long and bloody campaign that makes him enormously wealthy and popular, and gives him a battle-hardened army intensely loyal to him personally. When the Senate, alarmed by his growing power, orders him to disband his army, Caesar refuses. In 49 BC, he leads his legions across the Rubicon River into Italy itself, an act of open rebellion reportedly declaring that the die is cast. Civil war follows, and Caesar defeats Pompey decisively, becoming the unchallenged master of Rome. He is declared dictator for life, but many senators fear he intends to make himself king in everything but name, the one thing Rome had sworn never to allow again. On the Ides of March, the 15th of March, 44 BC, a group of senators, including men Caesar had personally pardoned and promoted, stab him to death on the floor of the Senate. Killing Caesar doesn't restore the Republic, it just triggers another round of civil war. Caesar's adopted heir, a young man named Octavian, allies with Caesar's loyal general Mark Antony to hunt down and defeat Caesar's assassins. But this new alliance doesn't last either. Antony aligns himself with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, while Octavian consolidates power in Rome and paints Antony as a man who has gone native, abandoning Roman values for Eastern luxury. Their rivalry ends in 31 BC at the naval battle of Actium, where Octavian's forces crush Antony and Cleopatra's fleet, and both take their own lives the following year, rather than be paraded through Rome as captives. Octavian is now the sole ruler of the entire Roman world, but he's careful never to call himself king, or even openly call himself an emperor. In 27 BC, the Senate grants him the title Augustus, and he presents his rule as a restoration of the Republic, keeping the old institutions, the Senate, the consuls, the assemblies technically intact, while quietly holding all real power himself. Historians call this arrangement the Principate, and it marks the true beginning of the Roman Empire, even though Augustus insists he's simply the first citizen among equals. His reign kicks off roughly 2 centuries of relative internal peace and stability known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, built on a professional standing army, extensive road networks, and a legal system that, for all its faults, brings a genuine degree of order across an enormous territory. Augustus's successors, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, are a decidedly mixed bag. Tiberius rules competently but reclusively. Caligula descends into what ancient sources describe as genuine madness and cruelty before being assassinated by his own guards. Claudius, dismissed by many as a weak, stammering figurehead, turns out to be a surprisingly capable administrator and personally oversees the conquest of Britain in 43 AD. And Nero, remembered as one of history's great villains, allegedly fiddles while Rome burns during the Great Fire of 64 AD and launches brutal persecutions against the newly emerging Christian sect as a convenient scapegoat. When Nero eventually takes his own life in 68 AD, the dynasty founded by Augustus dies with him, and Rome descends briefly into the chaotic year of the 4 emperors, before a general named Vespasian restores order and founds a new dynasty of his own. Vespasian's Flavian dynasty is defined by one enormous public project, the construction of the Colosseum, funded partly by the plunder from the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, when Vespasian's son Titus crushes a major Jewish revolt and levels the city's great temple. But it's the emperors who follow the short-lived Flavian line who bring Rome to its absolute peak. Historians call them the 5 good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, a remarkable run of capable, relatively stable rulers, chosen by merit and adoption rather than blood. Under Trajan, the empire reaches its greatest territorial extent ever, stretching from Britain to the Persian Gulf. Hadrian, more cautious, consolidates rather than expands, famously building a defensive wall across northern Britain that still bears his name. And Marcus Aurelius, remembered almost as much for his philosophical writings as his reign, spends years fighting off Germanic invasions along the Danube frontier, a warning sign of pressures that are only going to intensify. Marcus Aurelius makes one fateful decision that breaks with a century of adoptive succession. He passes power to his own biological son, Commodus, a vain and erratic ruler who spends more time fighting as a gladiator in the arena than governing, and is eventually strangled by his own wrestling partner in his bath. His death plunges Rome into renewed chaos, and by the middle of the 3rd century, the empire is in genuine crisis. Roughly 50 years of near-constant civil war, foreign invasion, plague, and economic collapse very nearly tear Rome apart entirely, with breakaway states forming in both Gaul and the eastern province of Palmyra, run by rival emperors who briefly rule as if Rome itself no longer exists. Rome pulls back from the brink through the efforts of one exceptionally ruthless reformer, the Emperor Diocletian, who takes power in 284 AD. Recognizing that the empire has grown too large and unstable for a single ruler to manage effectively, Diocletian splits authority among 4 co-emperors in a system called the Tetrarchy, and dramatically expands the state bureaucracy and army to keep control. He also launches one of history's most severe persecutions of Christians, an attempt to restore traditional Roman religious unity that ultimately fails. The Tetrarchy system doesn't survive Diocletian's retirement either, collapsing into yet another round of civil war, from which one general, Constantine, emerges as sole ruler. Constantine takes Rome in a decisive direction, legalizing Christianity in 313 AD and eventually converting to it himself. And in 330 AD, he founds a magnificent new capital in the east, Constantinople, quietly shifting the empire's center of gravity away from Rome itself and toward the wealthier, more defensible provinces of the Greek-speaking east. That shift turns out to be one of the most consequential decisions in the empire's entire history. When the Emperor Theodosius dies in 395 AD, the empire is formally split between his 2 sons, one ruling the wealthier east from Constantinople, the other ruling an increasingly strained west from Italy. The western half faces mounting pressure from Germanic peoples, pushed into Roman territory by the invading Huns, and Rome's overstretched armies simply can't hold every frontier at once. In 410 AD, Visigothic forces sack the city of Rome itself. The first time in 8 centuries an enemy army has done so, a profound psychological shock, even though Rome is no longer the empire's actual capital. Further waves of invasion and internal power struggles follow, including a second sack of the city by the Vandals in 455 AD. Finally, in 476 AD, a Germanic warlord named Odoacer simply removes the last Western emperor, a child named with grim irony Romulus Augustulus, echoing the legendary founder's name almost exactly. There's no dramatic final battle, just a quiet administrative end to 5 centuries of imperial rule in the West. That isn't quite the end of Rome itself, though. The eastern half of the empire, ruled from Constantinople, survives this collapse entirely intact, continuing to call itself the Roman Empire for another 1,000 years, even as later historians eventually relabel it the Byzantine Empire to separate it from the Latin-speaking Rome of old. But the fall of the West in 476 AD marks the end of the ancient world in the way most people think of it, the closing of an empire that had, over roughly 1,000 years, transformed from a legendary village of shepherds into the single most influential civilization in Western history. What Rome leaves behind is almost impossible to overstate. Roman law forms the backbone of legal systems across much of Europe and beyond to this day. Latin evolves directly into the Romance languages, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian, while shaping the vocabulary of English far beyond that. Roman roads, aqueducts, and architectural innovations like the arch and the dome influence engineering for the next 1,500 years. And the very idea of a republic, of checks on power, of written law applying to everyone, traces directly back to a small group of aristocrats who overthrew a king in 509 BC, and swore, however imperfectly they lived up to it, never to let one man rule alone again.